If you were to sacrifice everything about yourself, what do you think remains after that? And I do mean everything. Your memories, your emotions, your relationships, your experiences, all of it. What exactly makes you you anyway? What do you become if all of that was just stripped away in the blink of an eye? Who do you trust? Are you even able to trust? These are the questions that get thrust upon the protagonist of this story. Her name is Shanoa, and she is quite possibly the most tragic of all the mainline heroes that have ever visited Castlevania. Having everything that made her who she is ripped out of her in an instant. An instant that would and could happen to any of us at any time. Alright, maybe not in the magical sense, but trauma doesn't have to be magical to wipe away parts of who you are. Her name is Shanoa, and on broken ebony wings and with an empty tome as her life story now, she sets out to try and make sense of her situation, find the reason she lost everything but her life, and if possible, try to reclaim herself. How's it going, everyone? My name is Leon, and today I'm going to invite you to the Castlevania retrospective. It's time for the morning sun to vanquish this horrible night.
From this day on, the Belmont clan will hunt the night!
Okay, so right up front, surprisingly, wasn't really able to find much in relation to how this game was developed. If you go to Wikipedia or the Castlevania fan wiki, either one of them, and honestly probably anything in between, they're all going to say mostly the same things, which, in terms of research, isn't great. I checked for developer interviews, and while some of those definitely exist, they don't really showcase much. That said, I'll try to piece together what I can in terms of how this game came to be, but it's going to be kind of brief. Right, so development-wise, this game was released in October of 2008 for both the US and Japan. Weirdly, though, it didn't launch in the EU until February of 2009. Not entirely sure why that is, but I'm going to assume it had something to do with their rating system there. From what I can gather, this game was more or less started right after Portrait of Ruin had wrapped up. But according to some interviews with Wired back in October of 2007, Konami wasn't exactly itching to drop anything official on this new Castlevania game, at least until the release of Dracula X Chronicles for the PSP had run its course. However, after some time, some screenshots leaked, and a new Castlevania game was more or less all but confirmed. The typical people who played the role as you would expect were also here. Akihiro Minikata as director, Koji Igarashi as the producer, and Michiru Yamane serving as the composer, just to name some of the larger known names. Should be stated that the rest of the development crew from Konami did a fantastic job, and the credits at the end serve as a great reminder that this project is made by more than just a few people. Props to all of you, you made something truly great. Given what can be inferred from some of the interviews with Iga himself, the game has a female lead because, well, fans were asking to have a female lead. So far, that seems pretty on the level. The only other time there was a female lead before was Sonia Belmont for the Game Boy game Castlevania Legends. She, however, became non-canon, and with her gone, there hasn't been a female lead in Castlevania up to this point. When the game did release, it was during a time where Castlevania games are coming out left and right, almost non-stop. 3D, 2D, didn't matter. Castlevania seemed to be enjoying a high point in its existence. Order of Ecclesia was also going to have some kind of internet support and connect with the Wii game Castlevania Judgment. The online functions of Ecclesia are somewhat slim by today's standards, but back in 2008, this is about as cutting edge as it got. Online shops and a race mode that had 3 tracks to race on could be uploaded with the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection. This is now defunct. That service went down in 2014. So unless you can play with somebody nearby and or over an internet connection that spoofs the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection service, unfortunately, that kind of stuff is all but gone. Connecting to Castlevania Judgment, though, should still work. That is, of course, assuming you own both games and have the hardware for it. I don't own a copy of Castlevania Judgment, so I can't really test this out. But if you do, you can unlock Shanoa in Judgment, and get a few goodies in Ecclesia to boot. So it's kinda worth it, maybe? And, well, that's about as much info on this game as you can dig up, at least by conventional standards that anybody with a computer can do. This is the last game in the original Castlevania timeline to be released, and the series has been more or less dormant ever since. Unless, of course, you count Harmony of Despair, or that Grimoire of Souls mobile game. Otherwise, the last few Castlevania games to come out were made by Mercury Steam and take place in an alternate timeline that has little to no bearing on the original series. But to round this out, as far as the game's reception goes, critically it did really well, a strong B+ average with only a few outliers. The fan reception is a bit mixed depending on where you look. Some love it, others don't, but that's just the way it is sometimes, you know? That said, even though it did really well and won some solid accolades, it's a game that doesn't really get featured much, if at all. Unless you're like me and decide to make a video on it. Talk about this game is about as hard to come by as an actual cartridge for it. Very few and far between. Much like Shanoa's deeds in this game, the wider world will know little to nothing about it. A shame considering the work that went into the game as a whole. Beautifully tragic end to the series as it was. Order of Ecclesia is somewhat unique in how it operates mechanically. In just about every other Castlevania game, old or somewhat new, the main character has main weapons and sub-weapons. Shanoa does not. Her attacks are technically all magical in nature, even the basic swords and melee attacks. When you attack, you drain your MP bar. This means you can only attack so much before you need to stop and recharge that meter. This has never really been a thing up until now. Every other game allows for regular physical attacks that you can do basically non-stop, and a standalone MP bar for various magical spells, and, well, the hearts for sub-weapon use. Shanoa operates much differently. This might account for some of the game's difficulty, honestly, but I'm all for changing things up a bit, you know? Shanoa's moveset is more or less dictated by you. She can hold 3 glyphs, glyphs being the magic that she can use. These glyphs come in a few different flavors, and 2 of them can be used on each arm. You have the physical, then I'll put that in quotes, attacks, swords, rapiers, scythes, dogs, fists. Each of these weapons have their own attributes, broken down into blunt and slashing, and honestly that's kinda it. When you use these and defeat monsters, you gain points in mastery for that attribute. The more mastery you have with a damage type, the more damage you will eventually do, though it's a fairly steep hill to climb. The magic you can get with these glyphs also has attributes to them. Things like fire, ice, light, dark, lightning, wind, all of these can be used and mastered should you want to. And honestly, you should. Within reason, of course. I don't really recommend grinding out all these mastery points, but you can. Shanoa's third glyph is something that adds like a passive kind of buff to her. Things like upping certain stats or allowing for faster movement and health regeneration. Some of the more interesting ones allow for Shanoa to transform into other creatures or summon familiars. Or even fly. By far, the one you'll use the most, however, is the Magnus glyph. It allows Shanoa to use magnets to extend her jump and allow for some swift movement, if you can master it, of course. These back glyphs only use MP for activation. Once they are on, they stay on until you either deactivate it or get hit, though honestly that last one there, getting hit, only applies to a certain few of them. The big draw, and the key to Shanoa's true power, is the glyph union attacks. This is what the hearts are for. Shanoa doesn't get sub-weapons at all. No crosses, no holy water, nothing. Just union attacks. That said, these are fairly cool. Assuming, of course, you have a set of glyphs on your arms that allow for a union in the first place. If you don't, you'll do like a small wind burst. I'm not really sure what that's supposed to be, but that's what a failed glyph union looks like. If you do have a matching union, though, you'll get big attacks for big damage. If you know what kind of monster you're fighting and what they are weak to, you can combine these glyphs to allow for some truly big hits. Experimenting is, of course, half the fun. If you want to play it safe, you can always just kind of double down on certain glyphs, and that will always provide a strong union. But live a little. Try something fresh. Be careful though, these attacks can chew through your hearts very quickly. It's a good idea to make sure that you're using the best version of the glyphs that you have. They follow a pretty standard upgrade idea, a prefix for whatever Latin is being used to describe the glyph. Vol and Melio being strong and stronger. This applies to all glyphs, provided, of course, that they're not standalones. Much like the other games, you will find artifacts that allow for things like seeing enemy names, swimming, and double jumping. Honestly, there's not that many for you to collect, but each one is important and needed to get certain things and to new areas. Speaking of certain things, there are more than a few hidden chests in the game. So I recommend using the hat that allows you to detect hidden items in the world. The most important artifact you can find, however, is the glyph sleeve. This allows you to preload 3 sets of glyphs and swap between them on the fly. It's very good and really alleviates a small problem that this game has, and that is constant glyph swapping. Even with up to 3 sets to swap between, you're going to become pretty good friends with the glyph equip screens. The movement is overall pretty solid. Shanoa moves around at a decent speed, though honestly I do wish it were just a touch faster. Her jump height is good and the animations are fantastic. The run cycle is just, and her backdash? Perfect. So good. Well, I mean, it's not really a backdash, it's kind of more like a back one-handed handspring. In fact, all the animations are great. Falling, flying, idle animations. By far the best one, though, is honestly the most important one. Holding up. Holding up allows Shanoa to enter a stance. Her back faces the camera and her back tattoo starts to glow, along, with the rest of her. Arms up and outstretched, hair flowing upward and whipping around. Outside of just looking great. This serves a few purposes, though honestly, one of them is most likely just in my head. The important one, though, is absorbing glyphs. Whether it's from a statue, a defeated monster, or from a cast that a monster is currently doing, holding up will absorb the magic from them. It doesn't remove it from them completely, they can still cast that spell even if you steal it, but stealing it allows you to use it as well. Thankfully, the bestiary lets you know if a monster has a glyph to take and exactly how rare it is, if it's one that drops after death. Right, okay, so that other thing, While I believe it to be true, and I mean, it probably isn't, you know, much like holding down and B on the OG Pokemon games doesn't really do anything, I wholeheartedly believe that holding up regens MP faster. I mean, it doesn't, but I feel like it does. Does that make sense? It does to me. All right, a few other things real quick. The game is broken up into chunks, smaller areas that really don't take very long at all to get through. You get to these places by choosing them on an overworld map, which is somewhat new to Castlevania. This hasn't really been done before, well, now. They unlock one at a time, assuming you find the correct exit to the area you're in, and some of them just pop up as the story unfolds. Some of these areas are more involved than others, and the other section of them are pretty much just glorified hallways, but it's all good. More on that a bit later. Lastly, quite possibly the most important area you can find is Weigel Village. Here you'll get access to shops and side quests. Of course, you can only really do these things if you find all the villagers that are out in the world, and you should. These side quests are all important to do, if not for the rewards, then at least for the story as a whole. Alright, hey everyone, just gonna take a second here to do some quick YouTube house cleaning, you know? So, if you could, if you haven't already, subscribe, like, comment, maybe even share this thing around a bit, yeah? Got some good suggestions for you at the end of the video too, so stick around for that. Alright, that's enough of me. Let's get back to, Shanoa. Like I said at the very beginning of this video, this is a tragic tale, and we're gonna get kind of deep here. Nothing too problematic, I think, but all the same, if existential subject matter isn't really your thing, and I don't blame you, maybe jump ahead some. For everyone else, we're gonna get into the thick of it for sure. Stories in games tend to get overlooked more often than not, and that's kind of a shame because games offer up a very unique way to experience a story. This is primarily because we are the ones in control of the pace. Well, somewhat. And we develop a bond with the characters we play as. Out of every Castlevania game I have played, and I've played almost all of them, Shanoa to me is a character that I find myself identifying with more and more. I liked her as a teen because, well, I mean, come on, along with some other media that I witnessed as a young teen, Shanoa definitely skewed my, what's the tactful way of saying this, preferences. Her character design is 110% up my alley. Even now, I can't really refute this. The jet black hair, the long blue combat dress. She has armor that covers her more vital areas, thigh-high boots, again with some armor, and some 3/4 length long gloves adorned with, I think, raven or crow feathers. She's got some tattoos on her shoulders and on her back. Iga must have really liked her as well, since Miriam from Bloodstained is just Shanoa, but with the shorter dress and hair. Appearance aside, Shanoa is relatable to me now as an adult because of what she goes through. I'll delve deeper into this connection as it pops up in the story, but I can relate and empathize with what happens to her over the course of the story. In looking at games with a tale to tell, it's important to be able to identify the main themes, and in the case of this game, at first, I thought it was about loss and identity, and to some extent, it certainly is. In fact, I wouldn't argue with anyone who comes to that same conclusion, but I think it goes just a bit deeper than those two themes and ideas. No, I think it hits one theme in particular much, much harder. The game opens up proper with a long text crawl giving some backstory about the aftermath of Symphony of the Night. Richter Belmont has all but disappeared, and with that, so too did the hope of taking on Dracula, should he ever return. No one knows where the Belmont clan went. In fact, during the time of this game, Richter should actually be very much alive and kicking somewhere. Taking place in the early 1800s, many organizations started to pop up, trying to inherit the means to take down creatures of the night and Dracula should he ever be resurrected. Unfortunately, many of these magical organizations were unable to produce anything strong enough to combat any dark forces. All but one. Ecclesia had somehow cracked the code and produced magics that not only could kill night creatures, but also had a solid chance to take out Dracula himself. This is where we get introduced to Shanoa. She is one of the best in the organization and is currently the only one able to absorb their glyphs. Glyphs are the magic that Ecclesia came up with. They are ethereal runes that exist and, once absorbed, can provide powerful magic to those who are able, well, to absorb them. Upon entering the Enclave for Ecclesia, Shanoa runs into her friend and pseudo-brother, Albus. Albus was supposed to be out on a trip to find resources for Ecclesia, but decided to stop back in to check on Shanoa. Their meeting is cut short and ends on a rather sour note. Albus is not happy that Shanoa was chosen to wield the Order's most powerful glyphs, the Dominus. Dominus is magic that is taken straight from Dracula himself, the strongest thing that Ecclesia has and the only real means to defeat Dracula. We get introduced to Barlow here, the master of Ecclesia, and teacher to both Albus and Shanoa. The ceremony gets underway, and Shanoa begins to absorb all three of the Dominus glyphs. As she does, everything goes dark, and she collapses to the floor. Albus interfered with the absorption, took the glyphs, denounced Ecclesia, and took off all in one rage-filled expression of seemingly envy. Shanoa eventually comes to, and after weeks of recovery and training, we find out that she has lost more than just her consciousness that day. Her emotions, memories, and even some physical ability were just stripped out of her, a repercussion from Albus stealing the glyphs mid-absorption. Barlow then tasks Shanoa with tracking down Albus, reclaiming the Dominus glyphs, and if possible, try to bring Albus back to Ecclesia. A tall order for sure, but one that he hopes will allow for Shanoa to regain something of her lost self. Leaving Ecclesia, Shanoa heads to a long-forgotten monastery. Here she finds a few new glyphs and faces off against Athroverta, this weird shellfish demon thing. Oh god, it has a face. Gross. Anyway, entering the back room, you'll find Albus, and he seems fine. Yeah, fine. That's fine. After a lovely back and forth, Albus takes a shot at Shanoa and leaves. Looks like the hunt is still on. Shanoa's quest will take you all over the land of, well, they don't really say, actually, but I believe it's supposed to be Wallachia. Out of all of the locations, there are few that are as important as Weigel Village. In this village, you will find a lone villager trapped in some kind of crystal. It has a glyph that you can take. Doing this serves two purposes. One is, well, a new glyph, so that's fun, and the other is a mechanic or story beat. Basically, Shanoa needs to find the remaining villagers and set them free by taking the glyph. Each villager released will open up new quests and items for you to get. It's a win-win, really. Just about every area on the overworld map will have a villager to find, more or less. Certain areas do not have much of anything, really, except for being like a hallway, but that's not really a bad thing. I mean, if a road through the woods exists, you're probably going to take the road in the woods rather than go off into the wilderness, especially in the early 1800s. I mean, are you kidding me? Some spots are more like what some could expect out of a Metroidvania. Rooms on rooms, all stacked with hidden items and breakable walls. That said, even these are somewhat short. The biggest area that you're going to find before everything goes nuts is honestly not all that large in size. I think this mostly has to do with the fact that this is a portable game on a portable system, right? Every area was more or less designed to be played in small bursts and in a relatively small amount of time, is what I would say if it wasn't for one huge, I don't want to say problem, but kind of a problem, and that is...
Bring the life from you! You danced well.
This game is tough. Like, hard. Way too hard. Everything smacks you around like you are nothing. Even the most basic of monsters can slap you across the face and turn you into a fine red mist. Get used to seeing this screen a lot. Now, it's not impossible. This game is very much beatable, but my God, you gotta sit up and lean in. This ain't a game you can play casually. You need to be active in this game at almost all times. You want to know the real messed up part? When you beat the game, it has the audacity to give you the option to play again from scratch on hard mode. Hard mode? I'm sorry, was this not already hard? It can get more difficult? You want to know the really messed up part? I did it. I beat this on hard mode on my DS. I have that card. It's right here. Load it up. Hard mode. Clear. I don't know how I did this. Again, not impossible, but the amount, the patience it takes to beat this game regularly and then again from scratch on hard mode, what was I thinking? I must have been really determined. Yeah, this game can mess you up if you aren't at least trying to play it, and that is by design, I think. The last game on the DS, Portrait of Ruin, had its difficult parts for sure, but it is a cakewalk compared to this game. Even the Soma Cruise games are easy by comparison. Shanoa really has to bring her A game to stand even a remote chance. And I do think this game is as hard as it is because the last two were somewhat easygoing. Then again, it could also just be, well, story related. Alright, let's get into some speculation, yeah? So Shanoa isn't related to the Belmonts, and you can't use the whip or any of the holy magic that they use. And, well, she isn't Dracula reincarnated, so all that dark power isn't really hers to command. By all accounts, minus maybe the physical conditioning and the ability to use magic at all, Shanoa is just human. A human that is only borrowing these powers and has very limited amounts of mana to pull from. Add into that the way that Ecclesia made these glyphs, they really just turned demonic energy into a usable magic for the wielder. Shanoa is basically fighting monsters with magic that these monsters are using, and in theory, would be at least somewhat resistant to, right? Now, you can fight fire with fire, but you gotta be on top of how you use that fire. Real-life firefighters use this idea when a forest fire gets out of control. A controlled burn is what that's called, if I'm not mistaken. It can work, and work really well, but you have got to be pinpoint in how you use it. I think the same logic applies to Shanoa here. Now, keep in mind, this is just my off-the-cuff thoughts on it. Did the development team really put this much thought into the moment-to-moment gameplay? Did they draw on the idea of fighting fire with fire? Yes. But also, they just wanted to make a more difficult game, reminiscent of the older titles in the series, and I think they nailed that. Alright, my bad getting distracted and all. Let's get back to Shanoa and her story. Over the course of the adventure, you're going to run into Albus more than a handful of times. During some of these times, he will give you a piece of Dominus free of charge. It's almost like he's trying to research something. When Albus leaves, it's less hostile and more almost sad. Shanoa returns to Ecclesia, talks to Barlow about the nature of the glyphs and Dominus. Barlow seems earnest in his explanation on how this all works, to a point. He is correct in that if the world learns the truth about all this, Ecclesia would be more or less destroyed, because Dominus pulls on the power of Dracula, and that's dark magic. Once again, Shanoa is sent back out to find Albus and to try and bring him back. Along the way, if you've been finding the villagers, you can seek them out again in Weigel and run some side missions for them. They're gonna reward you with some pretty good items and a decent amount of cash. Running these is pretty much mandatory, otherwise you're gonna have a real tough time. Anything that gives you the option to get new gear is always worth it. The dressmaker, the blacksmith, the jewelry maker, the potion maker, just some of the more important ones to run tasks for. That said, I would run all the side quests for all the villagers, just make sure you run a high luck stat to get those monster drops, otherwise you're gonna have a rough go of it. Certain monsters have just terrible drop rates, and you'll be farming for probably hours. A few of these missions only open up as you get later into the game, or rather, some of the side quests require you to find some secret final areas. Assuming you're about as geared as you can be, it's time to find the last piece of Dominus and Albus. In the basement of a manor, you will find him, but he isn't himself. Parts of him push through to the surface but quickly get drowned out. Albus has somehow absorbed Dominus, and it took over his mind and body. The spirit of Dracula has basically taken him over. Albus needs to be stopped. This fight is kind of tough. I died a whole bunch here. If you know the ins and outs, you can probably take him down pretty quick, but I didn't do that. So instead, I got crushed. But you know, I was having fun with it, so it's all good. Once you finally do beat him, the truth of everything gets laid out before Shanoa. Barlow wasn't exactly honest in his telling of events. Albus was only trying to protect Shanoa. He knew what the true cost of using these glyphs was. By stealing those glyphs before Shanoa took them into her body, he saved her life, but at the cost of everything else that made her, her. With one final conversation, the spirit of Albus, Shanoa learns the truth and kind of gives a mid-effort of an emotional response to Albus's passing. Not through any fault of her own. She even acknowledges that she should feel something, anything, but just can't. She has one course of action now. It's time to confront Barlow and get some answers. Heading back to Ecclesia, Shanoa does in fact speak with Barlow, but it's anything but a friendly conversation. Barlow spills the beans, as it were, filling in the blank spots left by Albus and really showcasing the depths some humans will go to for their twisted beliefs. Having no other alternatives, Shanoa faces Barlow for the fate of humanity. This fight is honestly probably one of the easier ones, at least easier than Albus was, but Barlow can still mess you up. One of his attacks is a teleporting multi-hit combo where he trash talks on every punch. It does a decent amount of damage, and it can easily end you if you aren't ready for it. Once you defeat him, though, he talks even more about his plan and reveals that the vessel they have was meant to be destroyed, but not to kill Dracula. No, just to release his soul back into the world. Barlow gets empowered and then sacrifices himself to release Dracula. Castlevania rises in the distance. With exception to Shanoa, Ecclesia is done for. There are no other members now. She's left with nothing. No friends, no family, and seemingly no purpose. And it's all compounded by the fact that she can't feel anything. But that's not entirely true. She has one last thing she can try. A mission she gives herself. Take down Dracula. She approaches the castle, and with one determined step forward, proclaims herself to be the morning sun, here to vanquish this horrible night. Congratulations, you have now entered, more or less, the halfway point. Dracula's castle is the largest map in the game by far, and has some of the most difficult monsters, period. On the upside, though, it also has some of the best glyphs in the whole game, as well as having some very powerful equipment. So it's at least somewhat balanced. But that balance is almost never in your favor. It's a constant uphill fight. That aside, personally, I think this is the best design of Dracula's castle. It just feels right, you know? The backgrounds are great, the music is stellar, and it just is Castlevania, right? It took all game, but we got here, and we got here in style. All right, let's derail a little bit here. Usually in games, we hear certain themes that represent the main character. They tend to pop up at least somewhat early. Think things like Samus's theme, or, if you want a different flavor, Kratos' theme from the more recent God of War games. Or even themes that we associate with certain characters, like this one, and Snake from Metal Gear. Or, this Final Fantasy song. They pop up when this character has some sort of purpose being explored. When you hear this, you know that this is an important thing for the character to be doing or experiencing. So far in this game, where is Shanoa's theme? Can you pin one down? I mean, you could say maybe she shares the same theme with Ecclesia, as it comes up more often than not when she's on screen and when that story is happening, but no, that's not hers. The people she interacts with outside of the village are also part, or were part, of Ecclesia, so, that's not her theme. No, her theme doesn't show up until right now. An Empty Tome. Quite possibly the best title for a main character theme in the series. It perfectly encapsulates her and what she is. Empty. Nothing before now having been written down, or rather they were removed, and empty pages to represent her future, as that has yet to happen. For it to show up now? That's probably the best choice they could have made. It makes you want to see this through. Plus, it just sounds awesome. One of the best songs in the whole game, and possibly the series. That sense of empowerment is short-lived, however, not because of Shanoa herself. No, it's because, almost as if on cue, this castle just hurts. Everything hits so hard, even with the best equipment on, you'll be taking large chunks of damage at a time. You'll get stronger as you explore for sure, but the deeper into the castle you get, the harder everything gets in response. You'll end up having to check out just about every nook and cranny this place has, especially if you want to complete those villagers' requests. Yeah, that's still a thing. One of the last requests for you requires you to find a hidden exit from Castlevania. Doing that opens up two new areas, the training ground and the large cavern. The training ground isn't really all that bad. It asks you to navigate a few enemies, but mostly it's just about how quick you are on your feet and to prioritize your ability to master Shanoa's movement. Double jumps, Magnus jumps, everything but the flight glyph is fair game here. Should you complete it, you'll get some pretty great rewards. The large cavern, however, well, you're gonna need to be prepared. Heavily prepared. This place is no joke. I know I made some goofs. Oh, this game is hard, and it'll smack the taste out of your mouth or whatever, but no, this is it. This is the real test of difficulty that this game has to offer. This is essentially a boss fight gauntlet. 2 rooms per floor and 4 floors in total, the last of which is a boss fight proper. The first few levels really aren't all that bad. A couple big demons and a pack of murder bots. That's about it. The next floor, though, has a bunch of those large hammer knights and some of those all-weapon knights. And the third floor pulls all of those monsters into one last attempt at stopping you. Easy enough, though. The last floor, though, that's the one. That houses the Jiangshi. This is more or less, and I'm very much simplifying this, a Chinese vampire. You might be familiar with this if you've ever played Darkstalkers or the Marvel vs. Capcom games. Hisenko being the primary visual or, representation there. Unlike a Western vampire, the Jiangshi works a bit differently. It can't really be killed, just kind of stopped. And even then, that's temporary and limited to the talisman that is used to subdue the creature. There are a whole host of other things that make the Jiangshi unique in vampire mythology. If it interests you, I would recommend looking into it. It's kind of wild how they work. Anyway, this fight is one of the most difficult by far. Each hit from the Jiangshi does substantial damage, and if you get hit by those lightning orbs, well, for me that was like 400 plus damage per hit, so, you know, be careful. On the same note of being careful, when and if you defeat it, it doesn't disappear like all the other monsters in the game on death. Instead, it has a talisman placed on it, and it just kind of stops moving. If you hit it again on accident or, you know, on purpose, it will spring back to life and you can fight it all over again. Like I said, they don't really die, so, you know, just be careful around it. So, if you've completed all the requests from all the villagers, you can speak with the village elder and he'll give you a mastery ring. This is a pretty great ring to get as a final reward, as it allows you to double up on the mastery points for all the magic that you're using, essentially making it easier to level up the damage that Shanoa can deal. That said, double of any points, and the points are usually 1, is only 2 points, but, you know, there are farming methods out there to help speed up that process and get maximum damage, should you want to do that. That said, assuming you're about as strong as you want to be, it's time to tackle the castle. There are multiple areas, each having a boss of some kind. Wall, clown, shadow, demon. This guy was more of a pain than he probably should have been. But, yeah. This giant stone, combat, centaur guy, and death. Weirdly, though, death doesn't get any story here. It's like they showed up out of obligation more than anything. Still a pretty challenging fight, but odd all the same. If you beat every boss you come across, you should eventually also find the 3 heads of Cerberus. These glyphs are needed to enter the final area of the castle. So far, things have been difficult, but once the seal is broken, well, you're in for a whole other world of hurt. The final approach is full of the strongest monsters you can find in the game. That said, at this point, Shanoa should more or less be on par with everything that she encounters. I say should because the only one that matters most is still just outside her power range. Dracula is sitting in his throne room, as per usual, and greets Shanoa not as a threat, but almost as a visitor. Once Shanoa states that she's here to actually kill Dracula, that air of friendly conversation gets dropped. Not completely, mind you. Dracula thinks nothing of Shanoa, so much so that he calls this battle a dance. It should be noted that no matter how strong you got Shanoa, whatever level she is, how long you decided to grind attribute points, no matter how strong the glyph you use or the union of those glyphs, you are not able to kill Dracula. I would go so far as to say Shanoa had no hope of even really damaging Dracula. Sure, for the sake of gameplay, when you hit him, numbers pop up, but that's kind of a disconnect from the story. From the very start, his demeanor was that of a person dealing with something they feel is beneath them. Meanwhile, Shanoa is literally fighting for her life and punching well above her weight. It's almost like an insect fighting a human. Can she? Yeah. I mean, it probably won't end well for her, but she can. We see this in the gameplay. Eventually, Dracula grows tired of playing around. Maybe he took too many hits to the head. When he gets serious, his sprite becomes a 3D model and some new moves get added to the mix. Shanoa is still giving it her all, but it just doesn't seem to matter much. Her magic is a creation of man. It's not a holy whip with the power of a vampire's soul. It's not a power that is vampiric in nature like Alucard's is. It's man-made. It draws on the power of night creatures that are influenced by Dracula and his overwhelming power. So essentially, Shanoa is striking Dracula with a power that is flawed. It's enough to take out lesser monsters and demons alike, but in the scope of power that Dracula occupies, that the Belmonts and Alucard reside in, her strength doesn't compare. It's well above average human levels, but severely lacking for this particular engagement. So she doesn't have a choice. She needs to draw on Dominus. It's the only way, and Shanoa knows it. It's a huge gamble, but it's the only one she has. It's time to fight fire with fire. Letting loose this power catches Dracula off guard, and it outright kills him, dissolving away to dust. She had done it. Dracula was defeated, and with that, the use of Dominus, so too did her life come to an end. Collapsing to the floor, and in her last moments, she remembers Albus. Only, it's not a memory. Albus is with her, speaking to her. Shanoa takes comfort in this, as she can pass with a friend next to her. Only, she isn't dying. She regains consciousness and has a final, proper conversation with Albus. Confused as to why she is alive and actually feeling things again, Albus did the only thing he could do: protect his sister. He used his soul to pay the price for using Dominus, and in doing that, he was able to release Shanoa's memories and emotions from where they were inside of Dominus itself. With one final request, Albus asks Shanoa to smile for him, something that can give him peace and hope that Shanoa will be okay. Through her tears, she provides one last smile, the first and last that Albus had seen since this all started. As Albus fades away, Shanoa collects herself and escapes the castle as it crumbles. Standing on a nearby cliff, she watches Castlevania fall, and with a solemn turn, she walks away, silently and alone. Her name is Shanoa, and she lost everything. Everything but her future, and no one will know. Her story is a lonely one that will not be remembered by anybody in her world. Her sacrifice will be lost to time. A human who went above and beyond, doing something that people only talk about in hushed whispers in reference to legends of the Belmonts. Her name is Shanoa, and she is my favorite Castlevania protagonist. And her story will be remembered by me and others like me who have played this game. Near the start, I had said that this game uses themes of loss and identity, and this is pretty true. The game is very much about loss. Shanoa loses everything: her home, her past, herself, her memories and emotions, her family. Really, the only thing she doesn't lose is her life, despite her best efforts. At the end of most of the Castlevania games, the Belmont or Alucard or Soma in question tends to walk away with everything mostly intact. Things end on a happy note, or at least on a hopeful one. Not here. Not for Shanoa for some reason. Even though she defeats Dracula and saves the world, there won't be anyone for her to share in this triumph with. Her identity is tied to her loss. Intrinsically tied. But I hinted at something else being a focus on the themes here, and that being acceptance. Shanoa deals with acceptance in all of its forms. She needed to accept what happened to her. She wrongfully accepted the truth from Barlow. She accepted a request from the village elder to save the others, and because of that was accepted into the village as each one of them opened up to her. She needed to accept with no memory, no emotional ties, and an ear full of lies that Albus, despite everything to the contrary, had her best interests in mind. When he lost himself to the power of Dominus, Shanoa felt nothing. Could you imagine how nerve-wracking that must be? To know that you should feel something, anything, but can't. Not because you had nothing to do with it, but actually physically can't. Another awful thing to have to accept as part of yourself. Her confrontation with Barlow, breaking the student-teacher dynamic, breaking the daughter and father relationship. It was incredibly self-serving on Barlow's part, but to have someone that raised you from childhood turn on you and with such evil intent. Never mind the fact that Shanoa lost all those memories and Barlow still lied, but you can bet that he reminded her of just how long he took care of her. Really get into the psyche there, really guilt Shanoa. Defeating Barlow and watching him explode must have been another terrible thing to try and process with no emotion. She can't even hate him for what he did. All that this leaves for her, as the last surviving member of Ecclesia, is her mission, accepting that she's the only person who, at this moment, can deal with Dracula, or at least try. Even when fighting Dracula, she accepts that she stands no chance unless she breaks a promise, willing to accept death to save the world, and with no one to remember, no one to sing her praises. It is in this acceptance that she's able to regain herself completely. Albus and his acceptance of his job frees Shanoa and allows her to really live again. The brutal irony here is that now that she is whole again, she's going to have to deal with a whole roller coaster of emotions, and she will not have much of anyone to speak with. You can see it in the way she exits the screen after the castle falls. A slow and solemn head drop and turn. She exits the game in a direct comparison to how she entered the game. She heads left instead of right. She leaves Albus behind instead of running at him. She leaves with nowhere really to go instead of entering the halls of Ecclesia. In these last moments, Shanoa accepts that she has a new life to live now. This game is, well, I was going to say deep, but I suppose that's up to the player and what they want to see in the game. Some will play this and see a good to great game, one that is difficult and maybe a bit lacking in terms of how the player can navigate the world. If you want an interesting narrative, one that sees how the world survives without a Belmont or Belmont adjacent type, or even Alucard, then this is for you. I find this game fascinating, not only for the story it's trying to tell and the way it goes about it, but the fact that you play as, for all intents and purposes, a regular human. The only other game that does this is Lament of Innocence, if only because Leon Belmont was the first in the line and was just a regular guy. A powerful knight, of course, but until the wit becomes the vampire killer, he's just a dude. Just like how Shanoa is just a woman. This is my personal favorite in the line of 2D Castlevania games, at least in this style. It's not as mechanically deep as any of the Soma games, and it's not unique in its dual player system like Portrait of Ruin is, but it's the only game that has a canon female protagonist. It's the only one, I would argue, that is super challenging, and it's by far the only Castlevania that ends on such a dour note. If you haven't tried this game at all, and if you're a fan of Castlevania, then you owe it to yourself to at least try it out. Maybe you can appreciate it and accept Shanoa and her sacrifice. Her name is Shanoa, and her story is the most tragic in all of Castlevania. Hey there, everyone. Thanks for stopping in on this look at a classic. Well, in my eyes, at least. This marks the beginning of the actual Castlevania retrospectives, and there are a few more to go in this DS trilogy. On the docket next is Portrait of Ruin and the continuation of the Morris family, and by extension, weirdly, the Bram Stoker novel Dracula. Weird, I know. In the meantime, if you want to catch up on the spiritual successor, then head on over to this Bloodstained video here. Or if you want to take a look at a Metroid game and see the other half of the Metroidvania, check out this over here. Okay, be sure to like and subscribe and all that jazz. Until next time, keep it clean.